All right, get ready because today we're going deep, really deep into preclinical regulatory interactions.
Yeah.
This is all the stuff that happens behind the scenes that can really make or break a new drug before it even gets to the point where they're testing on people.
Absolutely. And it's kind of an overlooked area, but
Right?
it's really critical.
Yeah. So, like, what's the big deal here? We're talking preclinical phase, right? So
Yeah.
scientists are in the lab and they're working on cells. Maybe they're testing on animals. They're trying to figure out if this drug is safe,
Right.
if it even works, does what it's supposed to do. But like, why are regulators involved so early on? Shouldn't they just come in at the end and,
Yeah.
give it the thumbs up or thumbs down?
That's what a lot of people think. But, it's not really about getting permission at this stage. It's about getting guidance, from experts. Think of it like you're building a house.
Okay.
And you've got this great architect, and they're looking at your blueprints, and they're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
If you build it this way, you're going to have some real problems later on.
Okay.
You need to shore up the foundation here. You need to think about this over here.
So it's more about avoiding those huge, costly mistakes
Exactly, yeah.
down the road rather than just like a checkpoint at the end.
Exactly. Get it right from the get-go.
Okay, so I'm curious to see how this is helpful.
Yeah.
What are some like specific examples of how regulators can really shape how this drug gets developed?
Well, let's say you're doing toxicology studies.
Okay.
You have to do those.
Right.
The FDA, they're going to want to see some very specific data to make sure your drug is safe. You go to them early and you say, okay, here's our molecule. What do you think? And they might say, well, this molecule works in this kind of unique way. You're going to have to tweak your study design. You're going to have to look at these other things.
So they're like flagging potential problems before they even arise.
Yeah, it could save you months and months of work later on.
Wow. Okay, so it's like getting a sneak peek at the rule book.
Yeah, exactly.
Before you even start the game.
Right.
All right, that makes sense. So it's not just about toxicology, though, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like regulators can give you advice
Yeah.
on like the entire study design, how it all comes together.
Exactly.
Like what would be another example of that?
Well, think about rare diseases.
Okay.
Sometimes there just aren't that many patients out there.
Right.
You've got to be really smart about how you design your study
Yeah.
so you can get the data you need, even with a smaller group of people.
Okay.
And the regulators can help you do that.
So it's about being strategic.
Absolutely.
From the very beginning.
Yeah.
I like it. I like it. Okay, so we've talked about design. We've talked about avoiding those big problems.
Yeah.
But data is everything in this world, right? I mean,
Oh, for sure.
you got to prove that your drug is safe. You got to prove it works.
Absolutely.
What role do regulators play in just like figuring out what data you actually need?
Well, they're the ones who ultimately decide if you have enough data to get your drug approved.
Right.
So they know exactly what they're looking for. They know what evidence they need to see for different types of drugs.
Okay.
And different diseases.
So it's like packing for a trip, right? You want to make sure you have everything you need.
That's a good analogy, yeah.
But you don't want to overpack and have
Yeah.
this huge suitcase that you're lugging around.
And regulators can help you find that sweet spot.
Okay.
Not too much data, not too little data.
That makes sense.
Just the right amount.
Okay, now I want to talk about communication.
Okay.
How important is it to just be talking to the regulators all throughout this process?
Oh, it's absolutely critical.
Okay.
And it's not just about what you're saying. It's how you're saying it.
Okay.
You got to be clear. You got to be concise. You got to address their concerns directly.
Okay.
There was this interesting case.
Is this the one, was it about
Yeah.
bioequivalence? I think it was in that.
Yeah, that's the one.
Source material we're looking at today.
Yeah, so it was about generic drugs.
Right.
And they made some small changes
Okay.
to the way the drug was formulated. They thought it wouldn't matter.
Right.
But it turned out that those small changes actually affected how the drug worked in the body.
Wow.
And it ended up impacting their approval.
So even little tweaks
Oh, yeah.
can have a big impact.
Big time.
Wow.
And that's why talking to the regulators is so important.
Okay.
They've seen it all. They know what to look out for.
Yeah.
And they can guide you in the right direction.
I see.
So if those developers had just gone to the FDA first
Right.
and said, hey, we're thinking about making these changes, what do you think?
Yeah.
They might have avoided that whole mess.
That's a good point. Okay, so it sounds like it's all about just being proactive.
Yeah.
Even when it comes to little details.
Exactly.
And building that relationship with the regulators.
Absolutely. The more open you are, the better.
All right. All right.
the smoother the process will be.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm starting to really see how important this is.
Good, good.
And we're just getting started.
Yeah, we are.
Buckle up, because there's a lot more to come.
There is.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about like what these preclinical regulatory interactions actually look like. But I'm kind of curious about how it all works. Like, how do you actually get in touch with the regulators?
Yeah.
Do you just pick up the phone and call the FDA and say, hey, we've got this great new drug coming?
No, it's not quite like that.
Okay.
There's actually a formal process.
Okay.
You know, there are guidelines. And the FDA, they really encourage drug developers, they call them sponsors in the regulatory world,
Right.
to request these meetings at different points in the preclinical phase.
So it's not just like one meeting and you're done.
Nope. You can have several.
Each one focused on different questions or concerns.
Okay, so like what kind of meetings would you have?
Well, one common one is called a pre-IND meeting.
A pre-IND, okay.
Yeah, IND stands for Investigational New Drug.
Okay.
And that's the application you submit before you can start testing your drug in people.
Right, right.
So you have this meeting before you even submit that application.
Okay.
And you can talk to the FDA about your preclinical data. You can get feedback on your plans for clinical trials.
So it's like showing them your homework before you turn it in.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Okay, so you can get some expert advice before you make any big mistakes.
Yep, it's a really valuable opportunity to get everyone on the same page.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the FDA. Are there similar processes for interacting with other regulatory agencies?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like in Europe or Japan?
Absolutely. Most of the major regulatory agencies have these kinds of pre-submission meeting programs.
It's all about making sure that drug development meets global standards.
Okay, speaking of global standards, I know there's a whole bunch of regulations and guidelines out there.
Oh, yeah.
We've talked about the FDA, but what about the ICH?
Right, the International Council for Harmonization.
What do they do?
So they're basically the ones who try to make sure that the technical requirements for drug registration are the same across different countries.
So it's like the United Nations of drug development.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
They bring together the regulators and the drug companies, and they come up with these guidelines that everyone agrees on.
So it's like creating this universal language for drug development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I like it.
You know, so you don't have to start from scratch every time you go to a new country.
Right, right.
Like one example is Good Clinical Practice, or GCP.
Okay.
That's a set of guidelines for making sure clinical trials are done ethically and that the data is reliable, no matter where in the world the trial is happening. So that makes sense. You know, having these standards in place makes everything so much easier.
Absolutely.
For companies that are developing drugs all over the world.
It streamlines the whole process.
Right. I can imagine.
Imagine if every country had completely different rules.
Oh, it would be a nightmare.
It would be chaos.
Okay, so can you give us some examples of ICH guidelines that are really important in the preclinical stage?
Sure. One big one is ICH S6.
Okay.
That's all about the preclinical safety evaluation of these new drugs that are made using biotechnology.
Okay.
It outlines all the studies you need to do to show that these drugs are safe.
Before you even think about giving them to people.
Exactly.
Okay.
Another important one is ICH M3.
M3. Oh.
That one focuses on non-clinical safety studies for both small molecule drugs and biologics.
Got it.
It's like a roadmap for designing and conducting those preclinical studies.
So it's really detailed.
Oh, yeah. It covers everything.
Okay.
Like how to choose the right dose, how long the study should last, what kinds of effects you need to look for.
Wow, it sounds like regulators are really thinking about everything.
Oh, absolutely. They're very thorough.
And they're always updating these guidelines.
Right? Yeah, they have to keep up with the science.
Right.
You know, with all the new technologies and stuff.
So there's always something new to learn.
Always.
Yeah.
It's a constantly evolving field.
Okay, so for anyone out there who's developing a new drug, what's the most important thing they need to know about these regulations?
Well, the key is to stay informed.
Okay.
You know, keep up with the latest guidelines.
Right.
But it's not just about knowing the rules.
Okay.
It's about understanding why those rules exist.
That makes sense.
You know, it's all about protecting patients and making sure that we're developing safe and effective treatments.
All right, well, that's a great point to move on from.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the challenges and maybe some of the mistakes that people make.
Sure.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, talking about those early regulatory interactions, the role of data, all these guidelines and regulations.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It really is, and it all starts way back in the preclinical phase.
It does. Those early conversations can really make a huge difference.
I keep thinking back to that example we talked about earlier
Yeah.
with the generic bio inequivalence.
Mm.
It just goes to show you that even little decisions
Mm-hmm.
can have some big consequences later on.
Oh, yeah. You gotta be careful.
And it seems like communication is key.
Absolutely. The more open you are with the regulators, the better.
So I'm curious, from your experience, what are some of the biggest mistakes that companies make
Okay.
when it comes to these preclinical regulatory interactions?
Well, one of the most common ones is waiting too long to talk to the regulators.
Okay.
Some companies, they collect mountains of data,
Right.
and then they finally decide to reach out to the FDA,
Oh,
and by then, it might be too late.
yeah, like you said, they've already made some choices.
Exactly. Maybe there are some fundamental problems with their study design or how they're collecting the data, and now they're stuck.
So it's like trying to fix a sinking ship.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so don't wait too long. What else?
Another mistake is not being prepared for those meetings with the regulators. You can't just show up and wing it.
Right.
You got to have a deep understanding of your data, your development plan,
Yeah.
all those regulatory guidelines.
So you really got to do your homework.
Oh, yeah, the regulators, they're experts.
Right.
And they expect you to be prepared.
That makes sense.
Those meetings can be intimidating.
I bet, especially for smaller companies.
Yeah, for sure.
Who might not have a whole team of regulatory experts.
Right, but it's important to remember that the regulators, they're not the enemy.
Okay.
They're there to help.
Right.
They want to see safe and effective drugs get out there.
Just like the drug developers.
Exactly. So it's really a collaborative process.
Okay.
If you go in with that mindset,
Mhm.
you can build a good relationship with the regulators.
I see.
And that can make a huge difference.
Okay, so it's all about working together
Exactly.
towards a common goal.
Yeah, we all want the same thing, which is to improve patient health.
I like that. It's a good reminder.
Yeah.
We've been talking about a pretty complex process,
Uh-huh.
but ultimately it's all about helping people.
Absolutely. That's what drives us.
All right, well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of preclinical regulatory interactions.
It's been fun.
It has. I've learned a lot.
Good.
I'm sure our listeners have too.
I hope so.
So, for anyone out there who's developing a new drug,
Yeah.
what would be your, one piece of advice?
I'd say embrace the regulatory process. Don't think of it as a hurdle. It's an opportunity to work with experts.
I like that.
People who can help you succeed. So engage early, talk to the regulators,
Right.
be open, be prepared to learn.
And adapt.
Yeah, things are always changing.
That's true.
And at the end of the day, remember why you're doing this. You're developing treatments that can make a real difference in people's lives.
Well said. Well said.
Thank you.
That's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
See you.